The wind had been howling down the valley since morning, sweeping over the drifts like a hand smoothing a white shroud. Elias Garrison leaned into it, scarf pulled high over his jaw, boots sinking with every weary step. He had gone farther into the timberline than he meant to, searching for a downed spruce he might cut for firewood before the storm worsened. That was when he saw them, two great shapes half buried in the snow, shawls stiff as boards, rifles clutched but frozen useless in their hands. He thought at first they were corpses, left to the mercy of wolves. But when he knelt, brushing snow from their faces, faint breath steamed from their lips. Women. Apache. Tall as saplings, built with a presence that made his own body seem small. His instinct urged him to leave them, to let the wilderness decide, but another force heavier than instinct pressed down, that old weight of duty his wife had once loved in him. With a grunt, he hooked his arms beneath them, dragging one and then the other through the drifts. By the time he reached his cabin, sweat and snow streaked his face. Inside, the room glowed with a meager fire. He lowered them onto a buffalo hide near the hearth. The rocking chair creaked in the corner as though stirred by memory, the same chair where his wife once sat, shawl across her shoulders, mending torn shirts by lantern light. He forced the thought aside, set the coffee pot on the iron grate, and stripped the frost from the women's shawls. Their skin was chilled, lips cracked. He rubbed their hands until color stirred beneath the surface. The smell of coffee rose into the rafters, bitter and dark, carrying him back to mornings when laughter used to live in these walls. His hands trembled as he cleaned a cut on the taller one's temple, wrapping it in cloth torn from his own shirt. He had not touched another soul in years, and the intimacy of it left him shaken. They stirred by evening. Eyes opened, wary, dark, sharp as obsidian. The sisters did not speak at first. They sat up slowly, their towering forms catching the firelight in sharp relief. Hair tangled, braids broken by frost, they looked around the cabin as though measuring whether they had woken in safety or in a trap. Elias placed bread on a tin plate and pushed it across the table. They hesitated, then took it, hands quick and tense, as though expecting him to snatch it back. He draped blankets over their shoulders, and though they accepted the warmth, their silence pressed on him harder than any words might have. The cabin was no longer his own. The air itself felt altered, as though it held its breath. He sat in his wife's empty chair, staring at the fire. Across from him, the two women leaned close together, their profiles proud, their eyes glimmering with suspicion. The only sound was the crackle of wood and the steady ticking of an old clock on the mantel. Outside, snow swallowed the valley. Inside, Elias felt loneliness pressing in on him from every side, yet beneath it, something else stirred. Not comfort, not yet. But perhaps the faintest spark of duty, the faintest chance that the world had not forgotten him entirely. He did not know whether to welcome it or fear it. Snow gathered higher against the cabin walls with each passing day, piling like the weight of years Elias had carried alone. The valley lay buried in silence, fences invisible beneath drifts, the corral half swallowed. Elias moved through the days as though in a dream, splitting logs until his shoulders ached, hauling water with hands stiff from cold. But the rhythm no longer belonged to him alone. Whenever he turned, the sisters were there, watchful, silent, like carved figures that the firelight gave breath to. At night he lay awake on his cot, listening. Their voices rose in low murmurs, Apache words braided together like strands of wind through the rafters. He could not understand, but the sound carried a weight that felt older than the snow outside, older than his grief. Sometimes it reminded him of prayers, sometimes of curses. Either way, it carved into his solitude. He thought often of his wife then, as he had every winter since fever took her. He remembered her body turning cold in their bed, her hand slipping from his grasp while the lamp burned low. He had buried her on the ridge where the soil was shallow, where the wind scattered pine needles across her grave. Since that day, silence had become his armor. Words had felt useless, and men in town had learned to leave him be. The ranch shriveled, fences sagged, the barn leaned with the weight of neglect. He let it all happen, a slow surrender. Only now, with these women under his roof, did the ruin seem visible. The sisters, though cautious, revealed slivers of their own wounds. He learned their names, Naeli, whose eyes were sharp as flint, and Onata, whose face softened more easily though it held no less sorrow. From their gestures, from broken words in English, he pieced together fragments. Land taken, kin scattered, ambushes survived by the narrowest thread. The scars on their arms and shoulders spoke even clearer than words, old injuries carried without complaint. By day, they did not sit idle. Naeli, restless, found the broken bridle hanging by the door and mended it with sinew she drew from her pouch. Her fingers worked with practiced calm, as though reclaiming the right to be useful in a stranger's house. Onata took his rusted axe, dull from disuse, and set to sharpening it by the hearth. The rasping sound filled the cabin, rhythmic and steady, like the pulse of survival. Elias found himself watching them, not with suspicion, but with a quiet recognition. Here were souls who carried the same weight he did, though in different forms. Sometimes their eyes turned on him, studying, measuring. Were they testing whether he meant to protect them, or betray them? He could not tell. And so he gave them space, speaking little, moving with deliberate care, as though afraid of breaking something fragile. Still, moments emerged unbidden. When he poured coffee into 3 cups instead of 1, when bread was divided evenly without words, when silence itself became a bond more binding than speech. The cabin shifted with their presence. What had once been a tomb of grief grew crowded with unspoken questions. The walls seemed to lean closer, the hearth brighter, as though testing whether strangers could share firelight without striking sparks that would burn them all. One evening, Elias looked across the room and realized how long it had been since he had spoken to another soul. Not just words muttered in trade at the mercantile, but true speech, measured, human. His throat ached with the thought. Loneliness, once his shield, now felt like a hunger gnawing him hollow. And when he saw the sisters bent together in the glow of the fire, whispering in their own tongue, he wondered if grief was not the one thing they all understood without translation. The storm came down from the mountains without mercy, a wall of white sweeping across the valley until sky and earth were the same color. The cabin shook in its seams, the roof groaning under the burden of snow. Elias fed the fire with what would remain, counting the logs left stacked by the wall, too few for a storm that promised to last. The windows rattled, frost crawling across the panes like veins. By dusk the world outside had vanished. The door burst open once, wind shoving its way inside. A figure stood there, half swallowed by snow, cloak whipping. For an instant Elias thought it a ghost, one of those lost souls his wife used to warn him never to mock. But the figure stepped in with heavy boots, snow melting in clumps on the floor. An Apache scout. His hair hung in frozen strands, eyes sharp beneath the storm's mask. He spoke only to the sisters, words low and clipped. Elias caught none of it, but he saw the women stiffen as if pierced. The scout left without accepting food or fire, swallowed again by the white. Naeli's jaw clenched, her gaze hardening. Onata lowered her eyes, shoulders trembling. The meaning was clear enough even without translation, the chief was coming. Elias's stomach tightened. He reached for the old rifle that leaned by the hearth, running a hand over the stock worn smooth by years. Tomorrow might bring death, and he did not even know for whom. The hours dragged, stretched taut by the howling wind. Naeli sat at the window, the lantern glow catching her cheekbones, her braid falling like a dark rope across her shoulder. She did not speak, her eyes searching the storm as if to glimpse enemies hidden within it. Onata knelt by the fire, knife in hand. She polished the blade slowly, not in menace, but as though the ritual anchored her trembling. At one point a tear slipped down her cheek, catching the firelight before she brushed it away with the back of her wrist. Elias sat apart, repairing a broken hinge on the door with tools gone dull from neglect. His hands worked though the task mattered little, the storm would tear down what it wanted regardless. Yet something in him clung to the gesture, as though keeping one thing upright meant not surrendering entirely. Lightning split the night, a jagged blaze that lit the valley white for a heartbeat. Elias's mind was thrown back to the fever that had stolen his wife. He remembered the heat of her brow, the sweat pooling at her temples, the way his own hands had been useless to cool her. He had sat helpless in that same chair while death crept in, a storm no rifle could fend off. He felt the same helplessness now, the weight of inevitability pressing from the storm outside and the silent judgment to come with morning. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. None of them spoke. 3 souls bound by walls of snow and fate, each wrestling ghosts in silence. Outside, the blizzard roared its hymn of ruin, and inside, Elias knew that when the storm broke, it would strip away more than snow. It would strip solitude, perhaps his land, perhaps even his life. Yet he found himself less afraid of death than of being seen, truly seen, by those who shared his fire. Morning came with a stillness so complete it felt unnatural. The storm had spent itself in the night, leaving the valley blanketed in white silence. Elias stepped to the window, rubbing frost from the glass with the heel of his hand. The sky was pale, the trees heavy with snow, and across the drifted field he saw them, riders advancing in solemn formation, ponies stamping steam into the cold air. At their head rode a man draped in a robe of dark wool, his hair braided with eagle feathers, his bearing heavy with the weight of command. Elias's throat went dry. He moved back from the window, rifle within reach though he did not lift it. The hearth crackled behind him, the fire too small for the tension filling the cabin. Naeli stood tall at the door, chin high, her shawl slipping from one shoulder. Onata remained seated by the fire, hands clenched in her lap, eyes shining with something caught between fear and dignity. The hoofbeat slowed until they stopped outside. Silence pressed like a hand against the cabin walls. The door opened, and the chief entered without hesitation, his men waiting outside in the snow. He carried no rifle, only the authority of a man whose voice had never been questioned. His gaze moved first to the sisters, then to Elias, as though measuring the balance of all three souls at once. When he spoke, his words were in English, slow and grave, the syllables heavy as stones placed upon the floor. He declared that Elias, by taking the sisters into his home, had bound himself to them. It was no longer a matter of charity but of covenant. To shelter them meant sharing their fate. Protection could not be half-hearted. Honor demanded that it endure. Refusal would be dishonor, acceptance would be surrender, of solitude, of choice, perhaps of the life Elias once knew. The words settled into the room like snow onto branches, silent yet impossible to ignore. Elias felt every scar of history pressing against him, his people's wars with theirs, the blood spilled across this land, the mistrust inherited from generations. Yet beneath it, a deeper truth trembled. In saving the sisters, he had already crossed a threshold. Naeli's eyes burned, fierce with pride, yet shadowed by shame at needing his shelter. Onata's gaze held softer sorrow, as though she wished to spare him from the burden. Their presence filled the room with heat and weight, and Elias's chest tightened until he could scarcely breathe. He had not asked for this. His life had been carved by grief into solitude, and he had clung to that solitude as a man clings to the last dry beam in a flood. Now the chief's words splintered it apart. Elias looked into the man's eyes and saw no threat of violence, only inevitability. This was not punishment but decree, a turning of the wheel that would not stop for one broken rancher's wish. The beams of the cabin seemed to bend beneath invisible pressure. The space between hearth and door felt smaller than ever, as though destiny itself had stepped inside with the snow. Elias's hands tightened on the chair back until his knuckles whitened. His solitude was no longer his own to guard. The chief inclined his head once, as though sealing the matter, and withdrew, leaving the air heavy in his wake. The riders turned their ponies and vanished into the white. But the silence left behind was not relief. It was the weight of a life forever altered, pressing down on Elias until he understood with aching clarity, what had begun as an act of mercy had become a covenant. It would test every part of him that had not already been broken. The days slid into weeks, each one stitched together by work and silence. Elias rose with the pale light, pulling on his coat to face the brittle air. He no longer worked alone. The sisters moved beside him, their tall frames cutting shadows across the snowfields. They split wood with steady swings, their strength sending chips flying. They hauled water from the creek, shawls whipping in the wind. When fences sagged beneath the snow's weight, Naeli steadied the posts while Elias drove in nails, their hands brushing once, startling them both into stillness before they bent again to the task. Meals were simple, beans simmering in the blackened pot, bread scorched at the edges, coffee boiled thick. They ate around the hearth without ceremony, dividing food into 3 portions without need of words. The language between them became gesture, the passing of a tin cup, the quiet pushing of an extra blanket across the table, the steady rhythm of work shared until exhaustion dulled suspicion. One evening as they returned from hauling wood, Elias heard it, low and sudden, a sound that startled him more than a rifle crack. Naeli laughed. The sound was sharp at first, as though unused to leaving her throat, then warm, carrying with it something lighter than the winter air. Onata, walking behind with buckets in each hand, hummed a tune as if echoing the brightness. Elias felt something in his chest loosen, as though the ice of many winters had cracked. For the first time, he did not see strangers at his side but companions bound to him by survival. At night, firelight softened their edges. Shadows danced along the log walls as Elias studied them without meaning to. Beneath their shawls lay scars, thin lines across arms, faded burns near shoulders, marks of battles fought and endured. Their hands were calloused like his own, palms hardened by labor, not softened by ease. Loneliness, which had lived in him like a second soul, began to slip its hold. In its place came a more dangerous thing, longing. Not for passion that burned hot and reckless, but for the nearness of another human heart beating beside his own. None of them dared speak it. Instead, tenderness found smaller shapes, a cloak draped gently over weary shoulders, bread broken and offered first, silence no longer feared but welcomed. The valley, however, was never free of threat. One night the crack of a rifle echoed through the timber, sharp against the quiet. Elias sprang to his feet, rifle in hand, standing before the door. His pulse thudded like hooves against earth. Without hesitation, Naeli and Onata rose beside him, their tall forms unyielding, weapons already in their grip. The three of them stood shoulder to shoulder, firelight spilling across their faces, waiting for the night to reveal whether the shot meant raiders, hunters, or death itself. The danger passed, the silence deepened once more, but the moment remained. It was not only fear that bound them in that stance before the door. It was loyalty, fierce and wordless, earned not by blood or oath but by the fire they had kept alive together. Elias lowered his rifle at last, heart still pounding. In the stillness that followed, he understood what had been growing all along: love, not as sudden blaze but as kindling, fed slowly until it glowed steady in the dark. Yet even as warmth spread through him, the cold truth lingered. The world outside the cabin walls had not forgotten them, and the storm of men could break upon them as suddenly as any winter wind. The snow began to loosen its grip on the land, dripping from the eaves in slow rivulets, softening the frozen earth. Patches of brown showed through the white, and the air carried the wet scent of thaw and pine. With spring's breath came a reckoning Elias had known must arrive. He stood by the corral, mending the last rail, when riders appeared once more across the ridge. The Apache chief came at their head, his robe dark against the pale slush, his bearing as solemn as ever. This time there was no storm, no threat in his approach. He dismounted with the ease of one who already knew what answer waited. His gaze swept across the yard, the fences upright, the hearth smoke rising, the sisters tall and proud with shawls unbowed by shame. Naeli met his gaze without flinching, Onata straightened as if to prove herself more than a shadow. Elias felt their presence like a steadying hand at his back. The chief said little. He studied Elias, the lines of hardship across his face, the calloused hands that bore fresh scars of labor. Then he inclined his head once, no grand gesture, no word of blessing, but a sign of acceptance nonetheless. It was enough. Elias's chest loosened as though a weight had slid from him. Yet the world was not done testing them. That same week, dust rose on the road. A band of settlers rode in, rifles across their saddles, faces hard with the memory of old feuds and fresh resentments. They halted at the edge of the yard, the silence between them sharper than steel. The sisters stiffened at Elias's side, weapons within reach. Elias stepped forward, rifle cradled but not raised. He felt his voice rise from a place he had thought long dead, steady and low, carrying more weight than the words themselves. "This is my home. They are under my roof." The silence burned. The settlers studied him, expecting the broken widower they had always known, gaunt, hollow, easy to push aside. Instead they found a man flanked by two towering figures, his posture unyielding, his eyes carrying the fire of one who had already faced loss and would not be stripped again. Something in that sight bent their will. One by one, they lowered their rifles. Without a word, they turned their horses and rode back into the dust. When the yard emptied, the stillness that followed felt different. Not fragile, but earned. Elias lowered his rifle slowly, breath unsteady, and looked at the sisters. Their gazes met his, and in their silence lay the shape of trust, fierce and unspoken. That night, the stars spread across the thawing sky, clear and endless. Elias saddled his horse, the leather creaking beneath his hand. Naeli and Onata mounted theirs, riding beside him as they climbed to the ridge above the valley. The land stretched wide before them, scarred yet beautiful, rivers glinting where ice had broken free. Elias breathed in the night air, heavy with pine and promise. For the first time in years he did not feel abandoned. He felt bound, not by chains, not by grief, but by kinship, by the strange and quiet love born of survival shared. His solitude had not been shattered, it had been reshaped, filled with silence no longer empty but alive. He thought of his wife then, not with the ache of loss but with a softer sorrow, as though her absence had made room for what had now come to be. He had not replaced what was gone, nor would he ever wish to. But in the company of these two women, he had found something almost as rare, a second chance at dignity, at belonging, at the fragile warmth of life rekindled. The horses stood still at the ridge, their breath misting in the starlight. Elias lifted his gaze to the horizon, where night and earth met without seam, and felt the truth settle in him like embers banked against the cold. Silence, once his prison, had become his language of survival. And in that silence, at last, he was not alone.